Right. So for the last sessions with Dr. Shabbir, we are going to talk about a topic entitled Progressive Islam and the Limits of Reform, the use and abuses of unaided reason. We have a lot of conversations about reform today as well as the day before, so I think Dr. Shabbir will be exploring a bit more on the concept of progressive Islam as well as the project of reform itself and what are the limits and the potentiality of unaided reasons, if you like. So without further ado, I'll pass the sessions to Dr. Shabbir.
Thank you very much, Imran. Progressive Islam and the question of what is the role of unaided reason is the final session here. The way I look at this subject is, apart from the question about the politics of reform, whose interests are we serving, let's look at it from a purely metaphysical viewpoint, meaning what are the faculties of the human individual which lead to this question of reform and progress. So of course there'll be the question of what is progress, what makes a particular brand of Islam progressive. Is it because it's following the ideals of the Enlightenment, for example? Yeah, like that would be one possibility, which gave a kind of autonomy to reason. So the place to begin exploring this question will be, what is the nature of the conflict between faith and reason, which is really, the terrain of philosophy of religion. That what is it that we're actually asking in looking at the faculty of reason and applying it to questions of transcendent knowledge, not knowledge of empirical science, but the alleged knowledge of a supernatural realm. How do we understand this question about what is the role of reason and what type of reason? Philosophers have been very interested in the question of what constitutes human reason. So for example, to make it more easier for you to start this, what do you think is the difference between reason and, let's say, common sense? There's an interesting expression there. We call it common sense, but common sense is actually not common. We say jokingly of someone, he lacks common sense, right? So it's not actually a faculty that is universally endowed. You can be lacking in common sense. The French call it le bon sens, the good sense. Or we also in English call it native wit. Something that gives us presumably an advantage over the animals. So the question that's important in the background of this debate about the role of reason in discerning the contents of the true religion and of guiding us towards reform and progress is, what makes the human creature different from the animals? I mean, what faculties do we actually have that are different, that make us perhaps superior to the animals? What kind of a list could we come up with? Do you think that reason is the exclusive property of the human creature, meaning other animals do not possess it? How many of you think that dogs, for example, have reasoning capacity? Now remember, I'm asking about reasoning capacity with a small r, not talking about the faculty of reason, which we humans think is like conscience. It's something that makes us distinctively human. Do you think that dogs, though they do not have access to language, not literate language, do you think that dogs, for example, reason a response to something? Yeah? So for example, a dog sees his master at a distance, he's being enticed with food. Yeah? What other qualities would make the human creature have some unique faculties? I'm looking at unique faculties, unique processes that we think only we have, and which may be the reason why we progress. Let's take an actual example. Do any animals record their own history the way we do? We have people, professors of history, for example. Does any animal record in any sense, whether in symbolic form or obviously not in literal form? Does any animal have a sense of its own history, a sense of its own evolution and development? Is there anyone? Short-term memory is different. I'm talking about history. Does any animal have a sense of its own history? No? Elephants? elephants have a sense of their own history? Right, personal history, biographical history, yeah? Not the history of their species. Like dynasties of elephants who ruled, parts of Africa. They don't have that, right? We have it, and we reflect on it. Well, that's true, of course. We're only speculating about them. Generally speaking, when philosophers have looked at the human animal, that's an interesting word, isn't it? Human animal, implying that he's nothing but a animal species. What they've been interested in is to see what is the threshold that distinguishes us, which, remember, will become the basis of progress and of the notion that we move historically from one stage of knowledge to a higher stage of knowledge. I mean, presumably, Neanderthals and other early forms of the humans didn't have anywhere near our technological or scientific sophistication. But why is it that they didn't have that and we have it? And I'm not asking for a religious answer, by the way. Ashraf al-makhlukat, not that type of theology of our being the epitome of creation. I'm just asking you a factual, biological question that if you're a student of living animate beings, would you say, for example, let me take another example. Would you say that the capacity to cook something using fire systematically is a human prerogative? Does any animal cook food, and then present it aesthetically, or like we do on a plate? And does any animal do that? And if not, why not? So they don't have that capacity for cooking. Is that a failing or a defect of some kind? Remember, we do, right? Remember, officially we cook, we present food to other human beings as an aesthetic experience. What about another ingredient? What about comedy and laughter? Do animals have any sense of comedy? Could an animal sense that the situation had become comedic and it was time to laugh, like we do, right? Remember, a lot of you were laughing yesterday about your own life experiences. Could a group of dogs get together in that way and see the funny side of it all? It doesn't look as if they do, right? I mean, usually scientists say that language is the big threshold, that animals do not express themselves, and that this may explain why animals do not have a history of progress. Because we do. We have many capacities that give us the basis for progress. Although it can be questioned, of course, because some of these same capacities, somebody might say, have not led to progress, but to the fact that we, as a species, are capable of great destruction. I was reading a very interesting case study recently where somebody was speculating on the fact that Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, which is about the question of progress, whether progress is infinite or whether we're having any progress, and how particular religions are evolving under the pressures of modernity to progressively be more ethically alert, worrying about rights and the environment. And the question was posed, why is it that if there are alien civilizations, they've not made any contact with us? And one of the scientists was proposing a remarkable view, which is unverifiable, but he was saying that the reason is because all civilizations have probably reached the apex of progress and then killed themselves, like we are about to do now, I think probably in the next 50 years, right? You know what I mean? Nuclear technology, nations that, sort of at war in a very fundamental existential way of war, where people are thinking that such a nation is a threat to us. Not just a threat to our economic interests, but, if you're going to live on this planet, I can't, that kind of threat. The fascist kind of movements, which are saying some people need to be the object of genocide. So why is it that no aliens have made contact with us? The thesis was that all civilizations progress to a maximal stage of progress and auxiliary technology with it. And then, paradoxically, though we think we are reasonable creatures, we are actually creatures who are creatures of passion, intuition, common sense, but not pure reason. We make the wrong calculation, one wrong calculation, and the planet is destroyed. And that this may explain why no alien civilization has made contact with us, because all of them evolved to maximum progress, just as we do, but then they destroyed themselves before it's time to make intergalactic comparisons and start traveling and meet us and say, human beings, be careful. We were like you, but we stopped at the technological stage of nuclear empowerment. Look, we saved our lives and we're here. Instead, it looks as if, according to the scientists, everybody, all the different, creatures out there who may have even superior intelligence to us. It didn't save them. So that's the first sort of cautionary point about the fact that is reason an unmixed blessing? We have reason, certainly. We reason. Remember the process of reasoning. We think it through. We have strategies. But is it a mixed blessing? Do you think that if human beings were intelligent creatures, meaning had reasoning, but let's suppose that some faculty was missing in them. Like, can you imagine an intelligent creature who had no curiosity? It's a very tough question, actually. I don't know the answer myself, but it's something that I've been exploring for a few months now in an article I'm writing. Is it possible for an intelligent creature to lack curiosity? Because we assume that babies are curious as simply as a corollary of the fact that they are intelligent. That's why they're exploring, they're touching things and so on. Right? And of course, sometimes they may harm themselves. Would it be possible for in the future, a person to be intelligent but have no curiosity about things? Meaning, have no curiosity about the origins of the cosmic process. Where do we come from? Suppose you ask somebody who's an intelligent person, where do you think you come from? And he says, it doesn't interest me. Is that a valid answer? In other words, the question is, what is the point of religion? Does it increase curiosity in the right way? And is it a useful curiosity, or is it just a form of anxiety about the fact that we happen to be in this world? Now, I'm going to relate this, by the way, all to the question of what is progress in religion in general, and then I'll narrow it down to Islam as under the pressure of secular modernity. Muslims particularly are being asked to evolve rapidly into a modern civilization. What other civilizations took 600 years over, we are asked to do it in 50 years. Right? And remember, all the pressure is one way. Right? Secular modernity is telling all religions, particularly Islam, you've got to grow up, you're too juvenile, your ideas are backward. Right? It's not a two-way process. In other words, no secular nation. Does communist Russia take seriously the Islamic critique of communism? I don't think so. They're not troubled by that at all. Right? If we say, this is a bad way to live economically and so on, they would say, no, yours is a bad way to live. In other words, all the pressure is one way in the progressive Islamic movement, which, by the way, is the reason why one has to be cautious about its contents, which we'll look at in a minute. All the emphasis comes from one side. So if we think of the human creature in religious terms as being uniquely endowed, not just endowed, but uniquely so, with the gifts of language, conscience, the ability to tell right from wrong, memory, which institutionally means the writing of our own history, from which allegedly we're meant to learn, but we often don't. None of these gifts are there for the animals, so the human creature has the unique potential for progress in virtue of certain gifts and endowments that other creatures presumably do not have. So then the question is, how is it that progress is to be measured? There's a remark of the German philosopher Nietzsche that I quote, translating from German. Man does not strive after happiness. Only Englishmen do that. Of course, he's making a joke. This was in the context of the utilitarian movement, which was the idea that you should maximize the happiness of the maximum number of people. That's progress. A simple secular definition. If most of the people in a country are happy, satisfied, most of them, yeah, and they've reached a certain level of happiness, beyond merely the gratification of sensual desires, but intellectual desires too, then you could say that this country is making progress. So in an index of progress, nowadays, of course, they use the happiness index, meaning what amount of happiness have we achieved. What are you, by the way, on the happiness index, Malaysia? Are you quite high up? What is it? Number 2 or 1? Or? No, not quite that happy, eh? I got the wrong impression. Yeah? You could be, well, you must be among the happiest nations. No, you're not. People are always smiling in this country. That isn't true in England, by the way. Nobody smiles. People would be very suspicious if you smile at anybody. They'd think this person wants something from me. Or maybe he's a serial killer or something. He's trying to, people are immediately suspicious. But here everyone is smiling at everybody all the time. It's remarkable. So what would be the index of progress? Steven Pinker in his book Enlightenment Now, and he's not a religious man. He's of Jewish origin, but he's not religious. Basically says we should look at, for example, the fact that infant mortality rates have declined. That's progress, he says. Yeah. On the other hand, a religious person would probably not use positivist empirical criteria of progress. When it was said to Martin Luther, the reformer, that happiness is the purpose of life, he started frantically crying, the cross, suffering, suffering. He said, that's the purpose of life as a Christian, right? In other words, the more suffering, the better, because God is testing me. The amount of virtue we produce in society, a religious person would say that's the true measure of progress. And by that index, of course, most societies are not progressive because there's less and less restraint and people are just living lives according to their own moral standards. How then do we decide upon what counts as progress? In the context of religion particularly, and let's look at Christian notions of Christian humanism, which was perceived as progress after the Enlightenment. Christian humanism, not just humanism, secular, but Christian humanism, meaning what would be the Christian ideal of prosperity and flourishing? And then you can ask the same question about Islam. And then if someone says, well, Islam gave the world the noblest humanism because it was a religion that said you can serve humanity best by serving God. It's an organic link. And that the reason why the secular humanist fails to achieve any real prosperity and happiness and often ends up in suicide, for example, although that's partly a caricature, but he's sad, he's despairing, life has no purpose. The reason is that although it pretends to be serving human interests, really the secular humanist is subject to a kind of selfishness, maybe a lack of altruism, where you do acts of philanthropy and charity. That would be one way to compare progress between the secular ideal, post-enlightenment, and religious ideals. And within religions, there are different ways of looking at progress too. The reason why Islam is a problematic example is that a lot of people think that Islam actually is an unenlightened religion, and it's basically not suited to the modern world. Its ideals are medieval, for example, on penal punishments, right? So the progress would mean that you jettison large parts of the heritage of Islam, much of which claims to be revealed, and say, now we're in the modern world, we must do away with or abandon, let's say, certain punishments that look by secular standards to be unjust. It's a particularly acute question when progressive Islam looks at the area of gender, relationship between men and women. Are these fixed stereotypically forever and ever in immutable texts, or can we progress further? And what would progress mean? Now, I'll give you a couple of very strange and dramatic examples which I used in a debate that Tariq Ramadan and I gave in the Cambridge Union a few years ago about whether Islam is compatible with the secular democracy. Meaning, can Muslims live as progressive citizens, or are they bound to get into perpetual periodic conflicts with the liberal state? Muslims are living in a liberal state, then next thing you know, they're up in arms, they're demonstrating. What happened? Somebody drew some cartoons. Oh, I didn't know that was wrong. Well, apparently these people say it is. So I'm sorry. You know what I mean? Like many people are saying that the tranquility of the kingdom of liberal societies is constantly at stake from Islam, because it's a religion. In other words, the point is you never quite know when you've offended these people. Although I would have thought that the Charlie Hebdo people knew pretty well that they were deliberately being polemical, but that's the point. That it's something like a religion that is not only not progressive, it is consciously opposed to progress, which is very different from a religion that's merely stagnant. Nothing much is happening. The implication is that this is a religion that actually opposes progress. Remember the remark of the Scottish Orientalist, Sir William Muir, that against the Prophet and against the Quran, he picked up it in the House of Lords, a copy of the Quran, and said that as long as this book has influence, the world will never know progress or peace. Meaning it's obscurantist. It's committed to going backwards in time. Because this book, he said, is the greatest known enemy of human progress, civilization, and liberty. I'm paraphrasing him, but roughly words to that effect. It's a determined enemy of progress. That's the reputation of Islam in large parts of colonial Europe, when Europe was trying to colonize the world, and they found that the Muslims were most resistant to modernity. the other nations could be destroyed, but this nation tended to think that we could teach you Europeans something. You telling us about progress. In fact, it's mainly the enlightened ideals of progress of Islam in the area of philosophy and science that actually caused the rise of progress in the so-called Renaissance, the original Renaissance, not yours, Ehsan, but the one that took place in Europe, right? That Renaissance was caused by Islam's transmission and amplification of the classical Greek heritage as well as of Indian mathematics. So this was a question of civilizational pride as well, that Europeans were saying of Islam that it's not a progressive religion. Yeah, and I'm setting the context for the modern debate, by the way. Europeans were saying that, and Muslims were retorted by saying, you were in the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages was a European period of history, not ours. When you were in the Dark Ages, we were actually the civilization that was creating new knowledge. Now, of course, European civilization is the one that's sending space probes and acquiring astronomical knowledge and so on. And Muslims are not in the vanguard, in the forefront of the quest for human knowledge. They've fallen backward. There's no question about that. Intellectually, they're more decadent. So the question is, when we ask about progress, what constitutes progress? Is it moral progress, intellectual, technological, scientific, or an amalgam of all these things? In particular, moral progress, and that's the one that I think creates difficulties. Civilizations accuse each other of denying basic human rights. Again, the Muslim accusation would be human rights. The Quran gives human rights as a formal document at a very early stage of history. But the secularists would say, no, but let's suppose you look at the rights given to the people of the book. But they are Ahl al-Zimma, they're under responsibility to the Islamic State. You are empowered and you are giving certain rights to these people. You are tolerated minorities. Now, when will you progress to the proper ideal of citizenship in which, independently of your religion, you have equal rights? See, in the past, the world was divided on the grounds of empires, Christendom, Dar al-Islam. Yeah, these were the two big empires with an undeclared state of war. There was no United Nations treaty that you can't initiate a war. Anybody could initiate a war. If you were strong enough, if you were the Byzantine emperor, you could go to war and acquire more territory. Same with the Muslim armies. So at that stage of history where there was no, if you like, written international law about just war, what type of war is justified, what war is not, people simply made up essentially their own rules, and might makes right. Somebody might say that that motto is still true. I mean, look at America. It exempts itself from all sorts of international rules and does what it pleases, right? So in one sense, the power relations have not altered. It's just to do with brute power. But at another level, I think the feeling is that, at least formally, we've recognized that there should be certain limits placed upon human belligerence and our capacity for violence. And in fact, Steven Pinker, in his book Enlightenment Now, thinks that the world has progressed on every index. Happiness, technology, morality. I personally think that what he says on some of these indices is completely untrue. But I just would like to, before posing the question about how progressive Islam needs to be careful and cautious about who's censoring its contents and to what extent we can break away with tradition and to what extent we must be continuous with that tradition and to what extent we must preserve that tradition. Now, these are all different types of questions. How many of you think, by the way, that the world today is considerably better than the world of your parents, let's say 50 years ago, a generation ago? How many of you think that you're lucky to be alive in modern 21st century, Wawasan, you call it, 2020? How many of you think you're lucky that this is a progressive state of human history? No reason to be anxious, no reason to be sad. This is the moment of history that we've all been waiting for. This is utopia. We've reached the climax of human progress. How could it get any better than this? How many of you feel that? No, I'm serious. It's a serious question. I mean, you've got every facility. I mean, those of you who come from Kampong, the village environment, let's say Nagri Sambilan, let's say 40, 50 years ago, the level of development in a village, I mean, obviously people didn't have internet, maybe they didn't have electricity. Some people, like Pakistan, my native land, only some places would, until recently, have had electricity and running water. So that's material progress, courtesy of technology, which is based upon science. Of course, there's a negative side. that we're also now uniquely, for the first time in human history, we're now capable of killing the entire world many times over. America has that ability with the nuclear technology. This possibility did not exist in the time of the Emperor Charlemagne, for example, in the year 800, but we have it now. That's not progress, right? If there were ethical limits placed upon the abuse of science and the abuse of what's called ecocide, the abuse of the environment, then we would have the benefits of science without its detriment. In other words, we would have refrigeration and antibiotics in medicine, good things for us, but we wouldn't have to worry about the fact that we also have a silo with a nuclear warhead that could go off by mistake as a result of an error, and we would be completely annihilated. So there's this ambiguous thing about the legacy of science. So when all is said and done, would you say that the people, say 50 years ago, who were primitive technology, were happier living in a, let's say, a village than people now who have all the benefits of fast technology, but levels of depression perhaps are rising in most countries, certainly in the Western Hemisphere, right? So is it progress? I mean, Pinker's argument seems very facile and optimistic. He says, all these people say, oh, look at the decline of the family, people hardly talk to each other, everybody's, into their technology. It's all untrue, he says. He says the truth is that on every score, violence has declined in the whole world. Comparing with, let's say, the beginning of the 20th century, when we're about to enter the two European wars, would you say progress, leaving aside the personal lifestyle of people in a city, urban environment, would you say that there's been progress in terms of who thinks that the amount of violence in the world is continuously going down? I mean, after all, medieval violence was very graphic. People were executed in public and so on. That generally doesn't happen in the modern world. So are we progressing? Pinker's point is, yes, we are. The only exception, the only dark spot in this saga is Muslims. Because apart from America, the only country that has the death penalty among advanced industrial nations, lots of Islamic nations have the death penalty. So for him, this is a throwback to a medieval relic. So this part of the world is uniquely resisting progress. And we'll look at some examples of what progress means, particularly with regard to progressive Islam, sexual ethics, women's rights, and maybe if people are interested in the environment as well. How many of you think that the world has got objectively considered less violence now than 100 years ago? Is it a good time to be alive? The chances of being killed are very remote. How many of you think that? Is it a good time to be alive in terms of personal gratification? That's the examples he gives, about access to technology, internet. It depends on where you are, right? So there are countries where you could be killed. There is a lot of violence, right? So you see, he's writing from an American perspective, but he says that he's writing on behalf of the whole world. And I personally think that if you're living in one of the advanced sort of European prosperous countries of Europe, or indeed a prosperous country like Malaysia or Singapore not politically that free, but still very prosperous, yeah? I think you could legitimately say that we live in a world of progress and that everybody has some kind of status, everybody has rights, and that almost no minority of people can legitimately say we are persecuted. Everybody has a language of asking for political rights, no matter what type of minority you are. Now let's look at a number of actual minorities. Now, of course, women, and this is a favorite topic of reformers in Europe, certainly, about Islam, is that they say that the way one index of assessing a country's progress is to look at women. Go to the country and look at what the status of the women is. What are their family rights under domestic law to do with inheritance and marriage? How do the women dress? How free are they to make choices and options to pursue their own careers? And on those indices, some of the Catholic countries of Latin America, South America are backward, they say, yeah, because it's a very macho culture. The men have all the rights. Women are often seen in a derogatory way, less rights. And then they tend to generalize about the Islamic world and say that Muslim women are oppressed from Morocco to Indonesia, which of course is factually untrue. I mean, particularly in Malaysia, where I think quite a few women hold important posts in government, right? Even though they obviously are faithful to their Islamic heritage, but they also are exercising some degree of domestic political power. Now the question about progress and the Quran itself and the Sharia and how this question was posed, I think Huda asked me, should we be suspicious of any kind of, how do we know when we're being genuine in our reforms and progress, and how do we know we're not stooges or agents of the West? Because that's the external accusation, not only from within Muslim circles, from more conservative Muslims, but also the West may also think that we're promoting certain movements for our benefit. How do we know when the progress is real and not imagined, and when the progress is patronized internally and not by an external foreign power? Well, I'm going to ask you to just examine one question, which was the lecture I gave at Cambridge a few years ago. And that's actually on the question of the apparent obvious inequality in the law towards women. One is in the area of polygyny. Polygyny technically is the correct word. Polygyny in Greek means multiple wives. Right? Polyandry would be multiple husbands. And polygamy actually means multiple marriages without specifying the gender of the people. Yeah? So technically, polygyny is what Islam permits. Polygyny, literally multiple number of wives or women. Yeah? Thank you. Now, polygyny obviously looks like an example of an institutionalized inequality. And people who are looking at progressive Islam would say, well, in effect, even though without declaration, polygyny, meaning multiple spouses, that a man may have more than one wife, though permitted in the Quran, with certain conditions and with certain disclaimers. You can't show the same amount of affection to all the wives. But at the same time, the precedent of the Prophet and of earlier prophets, like Abraham and others who had more than one spouse. What do we do about this? What looks like a straightforward example of an inequality. Let's look at the inheritance law. In Surah Nisa, same principle. To the male, the portion of two females. That's actually the basics of all inheritance law in Islam, right? To the male, the portion of two females. So, when my father died, he didn't have much money, but whatever amount he had, I got, say, twice the amount of my younger sisters. But then, the apologist would say, well, it is an inequality, but not an inequity. Meaning it's not unfair. After all, my sister's not expected to help me with her money, it's her own money. Whereas as a brother, I've got two older brothers, our money, we are expected to arrange for their marriages, take care of their careers. We're expected to expend of our money, both on them and on our own, a spouse or spouses. So why shouldn't the Quran give, in that type of agrarian economy, twice the amount? Because after all, it's the men who do the spending. The woman's wealth given to her is not like a salary, but an income, a one-time payment that is for her own use. She doesn't have to use it on anyone. She doesn't, for example, have to use it to finance the wedding of a younger brother. She can if she wants, but she doesn't have to. So you could perhaps argue that away. But the really tricky question is about testimony, that the testimony in transactional, in economic law, at the time of trading, tijara, which was done without necessarily a written contract, was that the testimony of one man is equal to that of two women, in that extremely long verse of the Quran towards the end of Surah Baqarah. Right? Now that looks like a straightforwardly sexist principle. And many scholars have said, well, how different is that from saying, as they used to say in the southern states of America, that the testimony of a black man is worth half of a white man, or I think a third in Louisiana and some states. Straightforward example of institutionalized racism, sexism. This is a much more difficult question to answer, and it's very difficult because what would consist of progress in such a case? Should this law be abolished simply to say it's unfair? Should we look at the evolution of this law? Should we compare it? Like I do in all my work, I make comparisons. Yeah? So I'm going to give you a little historical comparison about this notion of testimony in Islam and in other religions and in other legal systems, and then ask yourselves whether A, Islam was progressive at the time of this legislation in the Quran, and B, is it a hindrance to subsequent progress, that this is actually part of a revelation? In other words, when a legal system doesn't declare on something, then you can have reform effectively through democratic legislation at any time. For example, in England, they could pass, if we think there's an inequality about paying women and men for the same work, economic inequality, you could simply pass act of parliament to say, we've changed the law, it was unfair. We can't do that in the Sharia as simply as that, because especially if it relates to some Quranic principle that is considered eternal. Morocco, incidentally, I was there recently, they were saying that there was a move to equalize the inheritance of men and women, but because it was so obviously contradictory to this principle, that to the male, hazal unsalien, right? To the portion of two females, that lezakara hazal unsalien. Quranic principle, Surah 4, basis of inheritance law. Because it's repugnant and in an obvious way towards the law of God, a revealed verse, the Moroccan authorities, after due consideration with the ulama and with the king, said that this would probably lead to riots in the streets. Even devout women would say, yes, we're getting more money, but we're contravening the law of God, so we don't want it. Yeah? So then the question is, how do we look at the notion of testimony? Right? I mean, at the time of the Quran's revelation, women had no right to give testimony at all. Right? Isn't it an innovation of the Quran that that women have this kind of testimony in any context, to do with tijarat, for example? But that's not the really shocking bit. Here's the really surprising part. The surprising part is actually that if you look at Roman law, Jewish halakha, Jewish law, Christian informal law at the time of Jesus, none of them gave women the right to testimony. And the clue is in the word testimony, which actually is a Latin word from an origin of a verb called testificare, which means that a man has to go into a court of law and prove his biological masculinity, that he has possession of testes, which is the procreative part of the human body. As a man, I have that. Women don't have that, which gives me, according to Roman law, it means that I can prove I'm a man and therefore have the right to give testimony. Same root as the word testes, right? How shocking and strange that on biological grounds, women are being excluded from giving testimony because they're not men. Women are told, you can't give testimony because you aren't men. Right? The legal concept is tied to a part of the human anatomy. So by definition, you can't. That's Roman law. Yeah? Not making up. You can check it up in the dictionary, look at the origin of every word you study and see what the origin is, and you'll be surprised. Now, even more surprising is that under Jewish law, except in the area of divorce and what was called the disappearance of the husband, a husband just disappears for no reason, and then the rabbis try and trace him. For 7 years, let's say, he doesn't appear. Then the woman can go to a rabbinic court, if you like, and say, my husband has disappeared. I'd like this to be a ground for dissolution of the marriage. He's not around. He gave no reason. Not that he was declared insane or impotent or one of the recognized grounds, for example, in Islamic law. Now, women could not give testimony under halakha, uncodified halakha, at the time of Jesus on the grounds that the rabbis said that women are incurable liars. They're not capable of speaking the truth. Hence, they are not capable of testimony. I mean, it's a very offensive view, it's misogynistic, as we say. It shows hatred of women. But that actually was in fact, a view held by most rabbis. Not all. They were progressive rabbis. I don't want to be, making a stereotypical picture. But I'm saying, in terms of codification of law, where the Quran says all these shares, to the woman, half the size of a man. I'm saying that the fact that it recognizes that is actually, in this context, progress. Because up to that time, the criterion of inheritance, correct me if I'm wrong about this, in Mushrik society was that you had to have the capacity to go to war. You had to be able to kill people in order to deserve inheritance. And of course, who does the killing in a war? Men, right? Women may be in auxiliary roles of nurses on the battlefield. But the point is that all these institutions and systems, they inserted into the very structure of their reasoning something that put women at a disadvantage. Obviously women aren't men biologically. They're women, right? Testimony. You can't give testimony because you're not a male, right? Roman law. Now, at the time of the evolution of Christianity, look at the New Testament. Those of you are, Christians here or perhaps know Christianity quite well. When the women go to the empty tomb and notice it's empty, they wish to give testimony to the other disciples that Jesus has risen from the dead and his tomb is empty. But their testimony is rejected on the grounds that they're women. Because remember, these are all Jews. Early Christians were Jews, following Jewish law. So what happens then is that Peter, who's the premier apostle, the chief apostle, is sent to confirm the women's report. And he says, yes, indeed, the tomb is empty. Right? See, male testimony is the only testimony. The idea of female testimony is linguistically incoherent, because women aren't men, they don't have testes. And in Jewish law, women are constitutionally incapable of speaking the truth. Therefore, they're disqualified. Now, these are incredibly racist and sexist and prejudiced views in this survey, and we can look at slavery in a minute too. But what I'm saying is that if you think of it from this particular angle, wouldn't you say that the Quran is actually a revolutionary document about testimony? I mean, you know, the Quran came down in 610. We're talking about a pre-industrial, pre-literate, pre-scientific, basically primitive culture. Why then, to get on to the question about progressive Islam, why is it that the legal and moral provisions of the Quran are being judged by the standards of 21st century secular feminism? It's a very unfair way of judging something, isn't it? Okay, which is not to say, incidentally, that the criticisms that are made, let's say feminist criticism of actual Islamic practice, possibly even of Islamic law vis-a-vis women, is that it is automatically unfair. I don't say that. I'm very happy actually to look at these objections and to assess them. What I'm unhappy about is when large assumptions are made about these things without knowing the context. Because only if you know this background about testimony will you realize that the Quranic decision to give women that right was actually a truly revolutionary reform. The question is, can it go any further? That's where progressive Islam comes in. Can it go any further without being unfaithful to the spirit of the Quran? What is the spirit? Not the letter of the law, but the spirit. Meaning, is the Quran trying to give women unrestricted rights? No, it's not giving anybody unrestricted rights. You know, men have certain duties imposed in the Quran that they might find irksome. I mean, imagine you're a young man of say 20, yeah, and you read a Quranic passage which says, "O you who believe, strive in the way of God," you know, meaning go and fight in His cause. And let's suppose you're a coward. You know, you're not physically strong, or you're just not very courageous. Wouldn't that trouble you? So does that mean that you say, well, this part of the Quran is untrue? Or does it mean it's unapplicable? I'm saying that the modern progressive criterion, that if something in the Quran is offensive morally or otherwise, that itself is a ground for saying, I don't accept it, is actually a very poor argument. Because in that sense, every constituency of reader will find something that is very demanding. If you're a young man, and the passages you think are speaking to you directly and saying to you, you know, if your land is under oppression, go and fight in the cause of God, defend. You may be killed in the process. And let's say, you know, you're not courageous. Then you'll say, I don't like this part of the Quran, so this needs to be reformed. Is that the right reaction to it? If you're a feminist and you read some aspects of the Quran and say, I don't like this, I think these attitudes are patronizing. Is that itself a basis for reform? Or is there something else? So let's take another example. Widely quoted about the chapter in Surah 4, which is a favorite of those people looking for progress, of progressive Islam, that, you know, the al-rijalu qawwamina, yeah, they are upon al-nisa. The preposition is ala, upon, right, not ila, towards. If it were ila, it would be possibly translated as men are protectors of women, meaning they're chivalrous, you know, like in the age of chivalry, they defend the women. But Allah implies obligation of the second part, as you know from Arabic grammar. So that makes it difficult. It's almost like saying that men are the managers, perhaps, supervisors of women. And why? Because they spend upon them. So there's a condition attached. And the context is the legal authority of the husband inside the household, with the even more problematic bit towards the end about chastising a wife, you know, which seems to be like a revealed warrant for wife beating, which is very troubling to modern commentators. Again, if you're a woman reader of the text, the difficulty you experience with that is perhaps you regret it. You say, well, I'm a woman, I'm a Muslim, I'm surrendered to God, but I don't like what is being said here. You know, I think this is unfair to me. If you're a male reader, a conservative male reader, you're probably very happy. You say, see, look, this passage gives me the right to dominate my wives. Of course, I'm not saying that this is the right attitude, but I'm saying you can imagine different people reading the same scripture and looking for different areas of progress. Earlier on, you know, Junaid was saying, you know, about being a reformer. Well, the question is, in which direction are you reforming a religion? Is progress a return to roots, or is progress something which is a flight away from the roots of a religion on the ground that it is outdated. It's very difficult to know that without looking at what context you're asking the question in. In a more generalized way, away from Islam itself, if someone was asked at point blank, remember my earlier point, has the world become a better place? Has it become more morally progressive in any sense? Not just about religion, right? Not about these particular religions which are allegedly outdated. Could one say that the world has progressed? And has the progress been in a way that is discontinuous? I mean, has our human nature evolved, is the question. Have we changed, I mean, emotionally, for example? Are we any different from people 1,000 years ago? People felt, the notion of shame and honor, the right to dignity. Have we actually changed, do you think? Do you think we're more sensitive now to people's dignity and shame and honor than, say, 1,000 years ago in world history? Has there been progress in that direction? Because only then can you, as a subspecies of that question, ask the question about each different religion, including Islam, to what extent has this religion evolved and progressed with the times? In other words, the question in progressive Islam is, what are the right concessions to make to the secular contender who accuses you of your religion being backward? What are the right concessions? Because to make the right concessions under the right context is a sign of strength and of moral humility and of integrity and of principle. But if you make the wrong concessions, meaning you feel dominated and you give up on what is essential to the, let's say, the core religious principles, then you're going backwards. It's not a pilgrim's progress, the title of John Bunyan's moral fable, but pilgrim's regress. Because that's also possible, that you might actually be regressing. To me, it's not an open question that modern societies are progressing. I think you could equally make a case against Pinker. I'm reviewing his book for the Times. I think that there's much more evidence in some areas that we are actually regressing and not progressing. Not as a blanket accusation. I recognize the advances of medical science, longevity. What's longevity average in Malaysia now? Is it 70 or more than that? I mean, in Europe, it could be up to 80, meaning, people were dying as young as 40, let's say 100 odd years ago, and now people are dying at twice the age, which puts burden on the National Health Service. But the point is, that's an achievement of medical technology, isn't it? People live longer. If you can treat an infection early enough, you can save somebody's life. That's definitely progress. But the question is, the fact that there's concomitant mental diseases of depression, alienation, lack of meaning, what does that show? That with technological progress has gone hand in hand a decline in, like a kind of moral regress. People are not finding purpose in anything. So as a blanket question, I think it's very hard to assess if someone says Islam is, or refusing to be, a progressive religion, that unique among religions, as Ernst Gellner said, the famous sociologist, it's the only religion that resists secularization. And of course, he was saying it as a rebuke, as a reprimand, but why couldn't the same line be said as a compliment? That maybe it's right to resist certain changes. So when I look at the progressive movement, particularly in America, what troubles me is that it seems to me that the progressive movement looks at the best of the secular values of American society, including rights given to sexual and racial minorities, and then simply rubber stamps it by saying, well, Islam already gave us all this, without saying no, but there are areas where Islam actually has put absolute vetoes and said, no, this is absolutely wrong, and therefore it's not really to do with progress, it's to do with whether or not the human creature is submissive in the production of virtue. So you see how the credential that you use here is very different. Yeah? So for example, if you, let's say, I don't know what are your laws on homosexuality in Malaysia? Presumably it's a crime here, right? Yeah? Okay. Now, it used to be a crime in much of the world, including the Christian Europe. Then roughly in the 60s, people argued that it's a victimless crime. If people are having consensual sex and they're of the same gender, why it doesn't harm anybody? That was the argument. It should be permitted. Of course, there'll remain, cultural prejudice, social prejudice, meaning people individually won't like it. But under law, you can't deny somebody a job on the grounds of their sexual orientation, etc. How many of you, this is a difficult question, but I'd like to gauge you on this before we say anything further about the progressive movement. How many of you think that true progressiveness in Islamic ethics, let's restrict to ethics, not law, would consist of Islamic legal systems more or less becoming the same in content vis-a-vis penal law and sexual law as Western nations? How many of you think that that would be the real index of progress? If, was said in Islamic law in Malaysia was more or less the same as what's said in American law. How many of you feel that way? And remember, this question is about law, right? Cultural attitudes may take longer. On the other hand, some of you may think that it's a kind of a frontal attack on the family if you permit the legalization of homosexuality. And I was mentioning to Dato over breakfast that, you know, Malaysia is a multiracial society. You've got, you know, people of different religions, backgrounds. Some people very devout, some people secular. But for example, I noticed when I was here 20 odd years ago, that there was a debate going on about the possible legalization of pornography, and your government decided no, citing that it would be a direct kind of declared attack on the family values of not only Muslims, but of Chinese, Indians, and so on. So as a society, we don't want to give explicit warrant to it. Of course, we're aware that, especially today in the age of the internet, this sort of stuff is widely available and widely consumed, but at least it's done secretly. It's a bit like alcohol consumption, although it may happen in Islamic countries. The point is that the countries don't formally declare that it's okay. So those who do consume alcohol still feel a degree of moral shame, and also they feel that legally they simply can't drink openly. There are some restrictions on it. So the question is, does progress mean basically license? Not freedom, but license, meaning having so many freedoms that you simply don't recognize any ethical restraint whatsoever. Of course, no Western countries like that. There are laws on obscenity. There's laws against rape, for example. Right? Nobody's arguing that, you know, there should be no law at all. There should be complete anarchy. But the point is where they place those limits is different. And for those societies, progress means placing those limits slightly here now rather than there over the last 30 years. What do we do in Islam when much of the stimulus for this kind of progress may be coming from outside? I mean, for example, internally in most of these countries, the rights of gays or homosexuals is not an issue that's being debated internally in Afghanistan or Pakistan. It's always as a result of Westerners going there, either as missionaries or otherwise, simply saying, how is it that there's no religious freedom in this country, or there's no freedom for sexual minorities? It's a kind of imposed progress. So is it progress if it's imposed? If it evolves organically and autonomously out of the consciences of those people, meaning they themselves feel let's say over 50 years from today, Muslim countries feel that we can now explicitly say that some of the hudud or some of the punishments for theft, cutting hands, is barbaric, and we can do it in a more humane way. And of course, there are mitigations in Islamic law going right back to Omar, right? Remember during the famine, the law of cutting was suspended, right? Because of course, in a famine, everybody's stealing, so you can't cut everybody's hands off. Mitigation is different. Mitigation means that you recognize the law in principle, and then you make exceptions to it in accordance with particular events. So what would be progressive Islam? I mean, the progressive part of it. Would it still be Islam true to the spirit of the Quran? Or would it be Islam that is actually true to the spirit of secularism, which rejects the idea of a supernatural being? Something to do with the metaphysical outlook on the world, where, for example, you do not think you are liable for what you do. You know, I often think of these politicians in all countries, including America. I'm thinking to myself, they get plenty of practice justifying their lies, you know, on television. Maybe it will help them on the day of judgment as they stand in the court of God's law, and all this rhetorical training they've had on CNN. And they'll try and justify their atrocities. It's not going to work, right? So that's a very difficult moral question. This progress question cannot be settled without asking yourselves what you think is the destiny of the human creature. You know, after death. Does anything happen after death? If you say it does, not only something happens, something very important happens, that you held to account for your actions, the supernatural eschatological sanctions you may be held. Those are the questions seems to be in the bigger picture. If you assess progress simply on secular material criteria and indices, as in the book I'm reviewing by Steven Pinker, then of course you could say that for large parts of the affluent West and the affluent Far East, there has been progress over human history, and it's been linear, continuous, except with a couple of catastrophes like world wars and massacres. But if you judge progress on the grounds of how much virtue is generated, with a perspective that is subspecies eternitatis, meaning looking towards the perspective of eternity beyond time and space here, then I think it's a more questionable, it's much more difficult to decide whether progress has been made. my main objection to progressive Islam is, at least in its American form, is that it seems to me that its motivation is extra Quranic. I don't see it as something that emerges out of concerns to do with Islamic living or with trying to grapple with the tradition of the Quran and tafsir, which are legitimate things. I see actually progressive Islam as being exactly like the development, unfortunately, of Hellenic philosophy, Greek philosophy inside Islam, where a lot of its anxieties were not native to Islam. Kalam was native, Mutazilite Kalam, dialectical Kalam, because it was about the Quran. How do we understand God's nature? Does he have hands? Are they literal? Is the Quran makhluk? Is it created, uncreated? These are concerns internal to Islam. But the idea of Hellenic philosophy, which was developed in pagan culture, was it was an enterprise that was foreign to the Quran, essentially. Right? I mean, the Quran encourages contemplation, but not extreme doubt, where you reject the idea of a creator and make reason, unaided reason, your true God. That's why it was an alien development. For me, progressive Islam, its content is so much shaped, content on sexual ethics, is so much shaped by a dominant secular culture with some Christian component, that I'm suspicious of it, and therefore I warn Muslims who want to do reform and who look forward to genuine progress, that make sure there's a progress that's rooted in your own conscience, not in the consciences of people who reject your faith.